As Secretary of State, he, of course, had to deal with foreign diplomats. How did he do that? How well did he do that? How did they view him? How did he view them?
Yeah. Initially, I'm chuckling because initially the view of him was not very favorable by the foreign diplomats. I mean, the British minister in particular, whose letters are perhaps the most easily accessible, wrote very critically about Seward, both when he was kind of the prospective Secretary of State and then in the first few months. He thought that Seward was far too ready to threaten a foreign war and far too, difficult and American to deal with. American being, in his mind, a negative term. And the other diplomats, similarly, the Russian minister with whom he finally actually negotiates Alaska, his initial reports in 1861 about Seward are not very favorable. People come to like him and respect him as they get to know him better. And so by indeed even the end of 1861, in the midst of the Trent crisis, the British minister Lyons writes home to say how constructive and useful Seward is, and how this would not have been solved as peacefully and easily with anyone else in Seward's chair as Seward.
How did he view the diplomatic corps that he had to deal with? Generally.
In general, he, and then coming back to his convivial, friendly nature, he, liked them, tried to, with each of them to find their good points and bring them out. So I'd say, there were none of them with whom I'd say he was close personal friends, but he was, warm acquaintance of all of these people. It indicated perhaps in the summer of 63 or 64, I think it's 63, Seward gets the idea that he's going to take them all the foreign diplomats, the senior foreign diplomats in Washington, 15 men. He's going to take them on a tour of New York, and he does. He takes them to his hometown, he takes them to Niagara Falls. Perhaps more usefully, he lets them see that outside of the Washington, D.C. area, the North is basically untouched by the war. The North is just humming along. And he's hopeful, I think, that they'll write home, the North could go on in this way for a long, long time. It's not gonna give up.
Interesting. You spoke about the Trent Affair, the crisis, in your book, and gave a parallel with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Give us a quick overview.
Well, the Trent crisis, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, arises near Cuba. An aggressive federal naval captain learns that four Confederate diplomats are trying to get from the South to Europe to seek recognition. Learns that they have just left Havana on a British merchant ship and seizes them from the deck of that merchant ship by sending a couple shots across the bow of the merchant ship and using the Marines, using force on a neutral vessel. And when word of that gets to Britain, it takes a while, of course, for word to get there, but when word of that gets to Britain, the reaction is outrage. This is an assault on the British flag, and in British view, completely unacceptable under international law. When word of that reaction finally gets to Washington, by and large, Americans think that it was a good thing to arrest those Confederates. They don't want to give them up. And it's Seward who has to persuade the president and persuade the cabinet that no, we really have to give them up, in part because of American views of international law dating all the way back to the War of 1812, but also because Seward is very well aware that if we don't give them up, there's likely to be a war with Britain, and the United States simply can't fight both the Confederates and the British at the same time. As one British friend puts it in a letter that Seward uses in the cabinet discussion, the moment a war with Britain starts, you have lost your war with the South.
Mm-hmm. Well, they did rule the waves.
And the parallel with the Cuban Missile Crisis is that the public was aware, not completely aware, not aware of all the ins and outs of the cabinet discussion, but aware that war with Britain was a real possibility. So it was a moment when the public faced the possibility of war with the most powerful other nation in the world, Russia in the 1960s, and Britain in the 1860s. So it may be a little overdrawn. There wasn't the sense of the whole world will go up in flames in a nuclear war, but that is actually the title of Amanda Foreman's book, which is supposedly a Seward quote from another moment at which war with Britain looked likely. And Seward supposedly said that if there's a war between Britain and the United States, the world will go up in flames. And so that's...
You have not found that quote?
I have found that quote. I have my doubts about whether Seward actually said that.
Why is that?
It comes from a book that was written kind of a year later by the British reporter Russell. And if you look actually at the letters that Russell wrote at the time, or other people at that dinner party, none of them use those words. And so I'm just wondering whether those words were kind of written in the calm of his study in London rather than uttered by Seward in a drawing room in Washington.
Fair enough. Now, you talk about him, Seward, being a founder of the American Empire. And certainly we all know of his folly,
Right.
Which produced Sarah Palin, so I guess it is. So what else did he want to buy besides Alaska?
Right. Well, actually, if we could just stick with folly for a moment, because it is interesting. Everyone knows that kind of the moment the treaty was announced, that Seward was denounced and mocked, and people talked about how it was just icebergs and polar bears, and there was sort of this general, Seward's folly. Research tools now allow one to look for a phrase in the newspapers, and so I looked. I couldn't find the phrase Seward's folly, and then I started reading newspapers, and I realized that almost all the newspapers were favorable. I mean, to take one, example right here in Chicago, the Chicago Tribune by this point thinks that Andrew Johnson and William Henry Seward are about the worst thing that has ever happened to America. But the Chicago Tribune favored the treaty because they thought that on balance it was, worthwhile. And I think the sort of nail in the coffin of the folly point is that the Senate votes to ratify the treaty with only 2 dissenting votes within a couple weeks of its announcement. So the initial reaction to the treaty is not Seward's folly. The initial reaction is actually fairly favorable. So, all right, shifting gears. What else did he want to buy? A lot. One reason that he was interested in Alaska was that he thought that would sort of surround British Columbia, and that British Columbia would then become part of the United States. He was very keen to acquire a port or an island or several islands in the Caribbean. During the Civil War, the United States was hampered by the lack of an offshore naval base, and he thought that was an important thing. Perhaps most interestingly, he was keen to acquire the rights to build a Panama Canal, and he actually negotiated and signed a treaty with Colombia that would have given the U.S. the rights to build a Panama Canal. Now, it wasn't ratified, and perhaps it's a good thing that it wasn't ratified because I don't think technically the U.S. could have built the canal in the 1870s or 80s, but Seward was very keen on it and pushed both the sort of public side, the treaty, but also the private side. A private company was formed mainly by Seward friends in New York to sort of build the canal.
I'm going to put you to work for a moment.
Okay.
And signing some of the books that have been already ordered, and we have a whole bunch of those, huh?
Okay.
And I just want to talk to a few people and thank you. Not all of you, I don't have the time for that, but some of you who have ordered and kept this shop going by getting books signed and ordering them and building up your first edition signed libraries, and as well allowing publishers to bring in wonderful authors as Walter is. So Tom in Maple Grove, Minnesota, Ron in Fargo, North Dakota, Jerome in Vero Beach, Florida, Micah in Aledo, Illinois, Joe in Milton, Georgia, Stephanie in Charlotte, North Carolina, Kevin in McKinney, Texas, Fred in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, Sandra in Dover, New Hampshire, Carolyn, and South Milwaukee, Wisconsin. You can come on down to us if you want. Richard in Excelsior, Minnesota. John and Kenny, Iowa. Richard in Malta, New York. Gisela in Newton, Massachusetts. Paul in Nampa, Iowa. Bobby in Wetumpka, Alabama. Tony in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Jerry in Clark Summit, Pennsylvania. Helen May in Bell, California. Howard in West Nyack, New York. Dan in Joplin, Missouri. Stephanie in Fayetteville, Pennsylvania. Todd in Des Moines, Iowa. And others, you know who you are too. We thank you. We usually shout out your names, but we can't do it all today. But we thank you all for helping keep us alive here. As you're signing your last one, I'm going to show this real quickly because here is the National Union ticket, actually from Massachusetts. Here's John Andrew as governor being touted, and at the bottom, at the top, is Lincoln and Johnson. And it was Seward who really pushed to change the name, the wording.
Yeah.
Not really. He didn't really want to make it the Union Party, did he? He kept it Republican, but he wanted to use it during the campaign.
Well, no,
Tell us about this.
Going even way back to the secession winter, he thought that the word Republican had become a liability, and he wanted to change the name and to change the character because he wanted, if possible, to bring in people who would later be called war Democrats, sort of more people who thought the Union was more important than states' rights.
Why would Republican not?
Well, it's just the question of, by that point, Republican was often, quickly turned into Black Republican. I mean, the notion being that the Republicans were keen to sort of put blacks in control of the United States. So he thought Republican had become sort of a liability. He wanted to change the name and change the focus to Union Party. So this goes back to not just 1864. For him, really, the secession winter is when he begins to talk about it, and indeed, so he was extremely happy that Lincoln and Johnson run on the Union Party platform in 1864.
And most electoral tickets, as we just saw here, had that Union label.
Right.
National Union, Republican Union, they did that too, and just Union ticket.
Union ticket, right.
So we see that all the time. We have 2 other virtual book signings coming up this coming week. And we can still get you any of these books for the holidays if you need that. So this coming Thursday, December 6th, at 4 o'clock, I believe, is John Meacham. This is Central Time, 4 o'clock on this Thursday, with his Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power book. He won a Pulitzer for his Jackson book, the last one, and he's going to be with us for Jefferson. And I think this is going to be an interesting time that we're going to have with him. On Saturday, December 8th, just 2 days later, at noon, same time here, will be Amy Greenberg, This Wicked War, John Lincoln and the U.S.-Mexican War, and Polk, and John Hardin, and other people, Henry
Seward.
Clay, and Seward, are all in this book. As well as Glenna Schroeder-Lean, who wrote Lincoln and Medicine, which is part of the Concise Lincoln Library from the Southern Illinois University Press. If you're building that library up, which I suggest for everyone, it's a wonderful collection, that Concise Library. So she'll be here for Lincoln and Medicine. January, we're not sure exactly what day, I guess, Bruce Levine, The Fall of the House of Dixie, will be announced. Keep tuned on virtual book signing for us, and you will know of that. He was also, Seward, interested in internal affairs, internal improvements, I should say.
Yes.
Lincoln came up to Chicago for the first time for the River and Harbor Convention. Seward did not come out for that, but he, as you said, he came up to Lake Superior. Was this part of his thoughts on internal improvements?
Yes, I mean, from the time he's governor, one of his big causes as being governor was to widen the Erie Canal, to build railroads, to build toll roads, and that sort of carries on right through his career. As a senator, he sort of votes in favor of almost every bill. I can remember one long, learned speech he gives about the role of Sault Ste. Marie as linking the Great Lakes. You would think that he had spent, weeks and months sort of studying, but he would be very happy today, to see the interstate highway system, to see folks ordering books from all over the country, because he wanted to knit this nation into one great nation.
Well, he was a Whig, and that's what the Whigs were.
Right.
Lincoln as well was on the same cue.
Right. Yeah.
What were, just very briefly, before we have to say goodbye to everyone, at least on the net, what were briefly his major accomplishments before as governor and senator, before the Lincoln administration, and afterward as well? Just list some of those.
Listen, governor, relatively few bits of legislation, the school bill, but more sort of outlining a vision of a nation. I mean, you've talked about founding an American empire, and he really begins talking about that and outlining that before. As senator, most of the major bills that pass during his time as senator pass over his opposition. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act would probably be the two largest bills, and he was dead set against both of those. So again, he's more a voice as a senator than actually accomplishing things. Secretary of State, his two biggest accomplishments are pretty clearly keeping Britain and France out of the war and acquiring Alaska. And then in sort of larger terms, maybe kind of sort of laying a foundation for an American empire that is not just the lower 48, but includes Alaska, Hawaii, and far-flung islands.
In the end, did he have any regrets in his life?
I think by the end, I think he was happy that the convention had gone on and not made him president. I'm sure, though, there were days when he thought about that, what would have happened if he'd been president during the war, or indeed president earlier. He might have been president earlier. But no, I think he felt that he had lived a good life, helped to save the American Union, helped to set it on a course towards its future greatness.
Walter Stahr, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Seward.